In 2012, I played Dragon's Dogma for the first time. Soon after, me and one of my oldest friends came up with what we call a parallel playthrough, where you play the same parts of the same game at the same time, as a kind of surrogate multiplayer for games that lacked that feature. And doing this parallel playthrough on Dragon's Dogma became one of our most treasured gaming memories, sharing and growing with each other's pawns. As many have said before me, this game was an incredible experience despite its many flaws and unfinished state. And so you can imagine the hype I had for a second Dragon's Dogma game, even before it was announced, hoping that after the first one's success, its true, full potential would be realised in the second. However, despite this, the bar was actually quite low. After all that Hideaki Itsuno, the game's creator, had to do was to take what the first game did and then fill in some gaps, upgrade the graphics and call it a day. He'd have created an even better game than the original, regardless of whether the full potential of his idea was fulfilled. And yet, here we are, 12 long years later, with supposedly the full support of Capcom behind a new game, and Dragon's Dogma 2 sucks. People apparently like this game. Some even say it's better than DD1. Others still say it's their favourite game of all time. Other than enjoying the game at all, I'm just at a loss as to how they could say this. Now listen, I obviously can't blame these people entirely. It's still Dragon's Dogma. The combat ultimately is broadly the same system as before, and so what was fun 12 years ago is still fun today. There's clearly things to like about this game, but my overall impression is that Dragon's Dogma 2 manages to retain the basic strengths that DD1 had, but improving on almost nothing, while doing several of its elements noticeably, and in one case, egregiously worse. So let's go through the elements of this game and explain why they let me down. We'll start with the minor stuff, and then talk about the really big problem that dealt the fatal blow to my opinion of this game. The obvious place to start is the combat. It's got that same feel that Dragon's Dogma 1 does. You mash away with your basic attacks, and then use special attacks while managing stamina. But now we have access to fewer of these special attacks, with the only exception being Warrior. We get the vocation system, which is great, and a valiant attempt at making each one unique with its own weapon and playstyle. But now they don't fit into a coherent system, with most theoretical combinations from the new 4-base vocation framework missing, and some interesting vocations missing from the first game. Additionally, the balance on these vocations is absolutely horrendous, where, for example, Thief quite literally has a click for invincibility move, as well as likely the best DPS in the game on top of that. We get cool looking armour again, including many that return from the first game. But we've now lost 2 armour slots, and thus some complexity and possibilities for armour setups. And then outside of this, we just get a repeat of the old problems, barely if at all improved. Although it is still slightly better than Dragon's Dogma 1, we get an open world with almost nothing in it once again. Although I appreciate the effort to give the game some real difficulty with the health degradation system, and the need to rest at inns and camps to recover maximum health, which I do think was successful, this nevertheless leaves us stuck with the pause to heal mechanic, something I consider a cardinal sin for any game involving real-time combat. And finally, as every Dragon's Dogma 2 review is obliged to mention, despite Itsuno's attempt to make exploration fun by placing enemy encounters along the roads, we are stuck with the same old, goblins, wolves and saurians over and over and over again, the same monsters we were encountering repeatedly in the first game. The second half of my minor problems with the game is to do with the aesthetics. All the elements that aren't strictly to do with gameplay. The music was the first thing that made me feel off about this game. While of course I was under no illusions about Dangan coming back, rest in peace, I did expect us to get the iconic themes of Dragon's Dogma 1. The Griffin theme, the Golem theme, or even, of all things, the main theme of the game, Eternal Return, especially after it was confirmed that the mythos of Dragon's Dogma 2 would be the same as the first. Instead, we got just one, single returning track, End of the Struggle, and even then, a once again slightly inferior form lacking the power of the original. Then, to replace them, we got tracks that, while good, did not live up to the originals and are not remotely as memorable. I enjoy listening to them, but as I write this script, I genuinely cannot recall a single melody from the rest of the game, aside from the track from the final battle with the dragon. The side quests and characters were about as good as DD1, which makes them just fine. The characters were, as before, almost completely devoid of personality, and this is a disappointment because I expected that more effort would be put in, given the greater funding and time awarded to this game's development. The side quests, on the other hand, while still being fine, were a solid step down from the originals. While its side quests are mostly the same, just some dull busy work with the tiniest veneer of story featuring the aforementioned boring characters, the first games at least featured interesting ideas, like insights into the nature of Arisens and pawns, with Celine and her former master Sophia. Like I said, these are minor problems. I genuinely think that if they were all that was wrong with this game, I'd have been mildly disappointed, but enjoyed this game all the same, simply because it offers another chance to play Dragon's Dogma. But at the end of the day, this game has one great big, glaring problem. The goddamn story. Credit to Gamer's Little Playground for the footage. I did not want to go and replay the game to collect it. After a prophetic dream, you wake up in a jail cell, a slave to some unidentified man with a strange magical staff. After a basic tutorial carrying stones, you choose your starting vocation and do a basic fight with a Medusa. Then, you are guided by the Pathfinder, using his mind control of the pawn Rook and a Griffin to help you escape before the Griffin is shot down. You're found by Justin, then guided to the nearby outpost while he explains that, similar to the first game, the Arisen is destined to become king or sovereign of the land, except this time, before defeating the dragon. Upon arriving at the outpost, the pawns bow to you, confirming you as the Arisen, to the confusion of Justin, as apparently, unlike the first game, there can only be one Arisen at a time. You then go to Melv, where you have a flashback to your becoming arisen. As in the first game, you showed courage against the dragon, and so it chose you and made you arisen, fated to defeat it by stealing your heart. You wake up to Ulrika looking after you, then leave with Sir Gregor for the capital to have your claim to be arisen assessed. After a short confrontation with the guards and Captain Brandt, who accuses you of being a pretender, you go off to a private room with him. There he admits it was all a ruse and that he knows you are the true arisen. He explains that Vermund has long been ruled by a consul in place of the true sovereign, and that now that you have come as arisen, the throne is rightfully yours. However, the Queen Disa, wife of the previous sovereign, wanted to hold power over Vermund and pass it down to her son, and so had you cursed to wipe your memory and sent away to the jail from the beginning of the game as a slave. Following this, she had a puppet put in place, a true pretender, to hold the throne until she could give it to her son. Brandt invites you to visit him in the local tavern to discuss next steps in claiming back your rightful place as ruler of the land. Now, let's pause. What an incredible setup. Especially knowing what I do about the first game, the game up to this point promised to be a truly fascinating story, with the intrigue surrounding Disa seeming to be some welcome inspiration from Game of Thrones. In particular, having this kind of politics surround the Arisen's status more consciously was just an amazing idea. Brandt informs you that, as one would imagine, Disa has made sure that the royal palace is filled with those loyal to her, and thus with those who will not challenge her branding you as a false arisen. He then proposes a plan for you to attend the coronation of Queen Disa's false arisen, and use your command of pawns to show once and for all that you are the true one. However, only the nobility and prominent citizens are to be granted entry to this event, and thus Brandt proposes that you deal with 3 different monster problems without the aid of the royal military to increase your renown through good deeds. And so you set off. Pause again. This is where the cracks start to show. It's pretty standard Dragon's Dogma. Like in the first game, you're handed simple quests from a central authority for the majority of the game, virtually forgetting about the dragon. I may even admit that in this game it's better explained why you're off doing all this, although it does seem less varied overall. Anyway, the real problem here is the fact that immediately after it is explained to us that Disa would have us killed if she wished, and that she holds supreme power over the land with which to do so, you simply go off walking around the kingdom, in particular the city where Disa literally lives and holds her power, without a care in the world. You even go a step further and actively make yourself famous by doing the quests Brandt sets for you. For some reason, you do this, and she doesn't even come for you. She could simply seize you again, and yet makes not even a single attempt to do so. The only explanation given for this is that, quote, "The assassination of the Arisen is an impossible feat for mortal hands." No reason is given for why that would be the case. Oh yeah, and that besides the fact we literally know that it's false, given that there are several human and bestian characters that can kill you in the game. And that's all before we consider that the various monsters around the game, like goblins and saurians and griffins, are almost definitely mortal too. You continue doing missions. You find out in an infiltration mission that Disa's son Sven is actually not part of her schemes, and get your first intimations of the role of the man Phasus. Then you meet Wilhelmina and find out about something called the Godsway in connection to Disa's conspiracies with the neighbouring kingdom of Batal. You pay a visit to Melv and save it from one of the game's new lesser dragons. You attend a masquerade ball in an attempt to get close to and learn about Disa's false arisen, and then go to investigate a town in the east to investigate his origins, information to be used to undermine his claim to the throne. All this seems to work as Brandt expected, and you go to the coronation only to find that the false sovereign has some means of controlling pawns. and are forced to flee when your pawn feels themselves falling under someone else's control. Another pause. My previous issues aside, all these missions are fine. I'd say they're at least as good as the first game. But now, you are bidden to go to Batal to investigate the origin of the Godsway. This is where the cracks widen into holes, although at this point you do not know it yet. So why? Well, it's because this is when absolutely everything that's happened so far in the story goes straight out of the window, save only for the basic Arisen stuff. All the interesting things that have been set up until this point, Deesa's plots and schemes, all are tossed straight out of the window. Nothing of any of it is seen or heard from again for the rest of the game, with no resolution. It feels to me that this is as far as Itsuno, or whoever did the writing for this game, could get, before being pushed by someone or other to rush the story to its completion. And indeed, it's this rushing that characterises the rest of the game in Batal. All is well as you make your way through to Batal, and then to the main city of Bat Batal. But when you arrive, and the game has the Pathfinder, the ghostly figure from the beginning of the game, just show up and tell you what's going on and what to do, namely, that the Godsway was produced here in the Forbidden Magic Research Laboratory, and that you need to find a man called Ambrosius on the coast. It seems to me that the Pathfinder is used here to fill in where an actual story should be. It would have been nice if we actually investigated all this ourselves, but as I said, this is where the game seems to be in a rush to the end, meaning there's simply no time for that, and so the Pathfinder just dumps it on you unceremoniously to save you the effort. Then they seem to skip even more story with Ambrosius. You go to talk to him. He asks you to collect the blue crystal shards, and when you do so, get the opportunity to ask him what they are. He just immediately tells you what they're used for, despite their insane power and use in a conspiracy to control a kingdom. He then has you visit the Dragon Forge to find out more about the Godsway, who I'll have more to say about later, and then Luz, who tells you to go to Harv to see the Dragon Forged, even though he isn't there and it's the Rivage Elder you have to talk to instead. When you get to him, he tells you a little about a sunken temple and legends about the founder of Vermund. And then, that sunken temple, right on cue, just rises from the ocean. Okay. You go down beneath the ocean to gain access to it, and find something that really had me at my most excited. Rothace, who, for those who've played the first game, is clearly a seneschal, or perhaps a former one. It's unclear. He thinks you sent to kill him by some watching one, whatever that is, but then talks to you about the Godsway and grants you a Godsbane, forged of his own heart. Finally, we're dealing with seneschal lore, but of course my excitement was false, because we were only surging toward disaster. Which brings us to the matter of the Forbidden Magic Research Lab. Guards tell you that you're not supposed to be there, which is right on brand with the name Forbidden, and yet you just waltz right in, with no opposition. For some reason, the only way forward here is to give the dulled Godsbane blade you just obtained straight to the guys who were your enemies 5 minutes ago in Vermund, and then go out of your way to help them in building another Godsway. No reason is given for why you are now working for your enemies, much less going and now slaying drakes to obtain the Worm's-Life crystals for them to do the exact same thing that made them your enemies. Upon returning to Ambrosius, he has finished fixing the Godsbane blade, and then he wishes to show phases. Funnily enough, he doesn't want to give it back to you, which makes sense for all of about 5 seconds, before once again the Pathfinder comes in and uses mind control to force him to give it to you anyway. Then again, just tells you where you need to go. Can't have pesky story coherence getting in the way of forcing the plot to advance forward after all. You go to find Phasus as he begins moving off to Volcanic Island. Upon passing a door that inexplicably requires something made of an Arisen's heart to open, the Talos awakens, a giant bronze man that begins chasing Phasus. For some reason, it's a problem that a humongous monster is chasing down Phasus, and you give it pursuit and can attempt to kill it, although I should really not be surprised at this point, given we are literally hunting this man down so we can yet again hand over powerful artifacts to our enemy. Then again, maybe he is supposed to not be our enemy at this point. Although he should be, given that the false sovereign is literally with him at this point. It's all a bit difficult to make any sense of what's going on. You press onward to Moonglint Tower, which turns out to be towering above, right next to the place where you were in jail at the beginning of the game. When you reach the top, you have this weird, chaotic fight that you don't even need to win, before Phasus tries to summon and control the dragon. However, he only manages to summon a pimple drake before it's destroyed by the actual dragon. At this point, I was frowning. Confused. Is this really it? I hoped desperately that this was like the moment after you confront Salvation at the castle in the first game, that this was some initial confrontation with the dragon, the real one to come later. But no, this was really it. The dragon reveals your beloved in his claws and offers you the chance to give them up or stand and fight. No epic build-up, it just drops on your head, while you're still trying to understand how we got to Phasus trying to control the dragon. God, I was angry at this point, but thought I'd try and see the fight through to the end. You challenge the dragon, and it asks you to climb on its back so you can fly to its chosen battlefield. You get a long, at the time, nonsensical garble about will and the world from the dragon, and then you just fight, and that's it. Somehow it felt on brand, given how in the first game, Grigori gives you the choice to face him, and yet bizarre and silly somehow at the same time. The moment Grigori found out you were ready to fight, he began ripping through the temple, and we get multiple phases, and he seems to be desperately trying to kill you. Yet this one politely takes you to a nice, neat little arena where the entire battle takes place. So we get a combination of the total lack of build-up, lack of rationale, given that there were no hints he has your beloved beforehand, nor the grandeur of the first game. And to top it all off, I found the fight repetitive in the extreme. The dragon having only a few moves, and you having to break the heart open repeatedly to do any meaningful damage, instead of being able to the whole fight once it's exposed. Now I'll be up front at this point. I did the whole fight down to the tiniest sliver of health at the end, but because I had changed vocations throughout the game, I was quite weak, and so it was a long and arduous fight, something that usually would make me enjoy it more, and then lost. I was in such a bad mood about the game at this point, given everything I just said, that I just stopped playing it. I just couldn't bring myself to continue, given what an utter letdown it had been so far. Instead, I looked it up online, and man am I glad I did, because the story that follows is even worse. Upon defeating the dragon, we get the first direct look at the absolute nonsense that is this game's mythos.
By will alone doth the world form a ring, an unending cycle. All is preordained, even my death at thine hands.
Which is it then? Is it determined by will? Or are all just empty vessels being guided by fate or other outside forces? You literally have to pick one. And yet it seems Dragon's Dogma 2 doesn't want to. At least the dragon then admits that a will great enough can change things. Following this, your Arisen is crowned as sovereign, which they would have been even if they had not fought the dragon. Nothing whatsoever is seen of your beloved at this point, even though you just saved them. Out of curiosity, you the player may speak to the Pathfinder, which initiates the true ending of the game. For some reason, this is taken as a challenge and thirst for power or status. Then, the Pathfinder sends you back in time to ride on the dragon's back, with none of your items replenished, I might add, with no hints whatsoever on what to do differently. Turns out, you have to climb down to the dragon's heart, then use the God's Bane blade on yourself? And then the dragon dies? What the hell is this utter nonsense? No hints, not even the tiniest indication, and no logic whatsoever to the idea you should do this. Some may say, well, you had to do something like that in the first game. But I think the two situations are completely different. In the first game, stabbing yourself is the final act of the game, and awards you an overall nice but not overly significant cutscene of your pawn gaining free will at the end. The game is already over at that point, and the game is set up to allow you to do pretty much nothing else, so there's at least some chance you do it, and it's of no real consequence if you don't. Additionally, your character has an actual reason to do it. They learn of a cruel, unending cycle that involves them being stuck in an endless void, completely alone but for their pawn. In Dragon's Dogma 2, not only is none of this true, this completely nonsensical choice is the barrier between you and the literal endgame, several hours of content. Not to mention, New Game Bloody Plus. Anyway, on with the rant, I suppose. After stabbing yourself and the dragon dying, you both fall into the ocean, and thus the brine. There, you end up in some other world where the Pathfinder says you have strayed. Somehow. He summons apparitions of characters close to you, as if you didn't just watch him do it, as if you didn't just see them with red eyes, and bids you to return to your predestined fate of becoming sovereign. You reject this, casting away the illusion, and so the Pathfinder says he'll show you what the world looks like if you don't follow the grand plan of the greater will who decided on your fate. You wake up in the unmoored world, where the seas have dried up and all is in chaos. Supposedly this is your fault, though it remains unclear why. You meet with Phasus, who watches over your now unconscious pawn. He explains that in the month you were gone, the sea rose to the sky, and several dragons showed up to destroy everything. The rest of the story doesn't really need explaining in detail. You go around the settlements of the world, helping them evacuate what is made to clearly appear as a ruined Grand Soren from the first game, defeating weird brine monsters on the way. This part of the game has received good reviews, and I can see why. It doesn't seem too bad. But then, once you defeat the final monster, you see one last big dragon come out of the sky. Your pawn turns into some kind of weird oil dragon that seems to be the result of Dragon's Plague, then carries you up to the big dragon. You begin climbing up to the dragon while receiving another speech that we'll cover in a minute. Then with the help of your pawn, stab the dragon with the God's Bane blade. Somehow this is good and returns the world to normal, despite it apparently being the Pathfinder and cutting this world off from all others, and the Watching One. The end? What a load of bloody rubbish. What does any of this mean? But my rambling rant still is not over, dear viewer, because what really had me finished with this game for good was the mythos. The damn mythos. I love Dragon's Dogma's mythos. The cycle of eternal return, the Nietzschean themes, where the seneschal sends the dragon into the world to find one with a will strong enough to sustain the world over and over again, and all the other little bits to surround this basic narrative. I loved it so much, I spent 3 to 4 months making 3 videos on the topic. Which you should definitely go and watch, by the way. Please and thank you. So you can imagine just how excited I was to see a fresh take on it with Dragon's Dogma 2. But it's as if, with this sequel, it's, tossed out basically everything of substance in that mythos. right down to the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, and just tried to dress it up to look superficially connected so he could still pass it off as the same series. And before I continue, yes, I know that the mythos of Dragon's Dogma 2 is supposed to be part of the same universe as Dragon's Dogma 1, it's just overturned the substantial and interesting mythos from the first game and replaced it with something stupid and shallow with the new additions. Let's compare. The original mythos of Dragon's Dogma 1 is as follows. The world's existence is sustained by the creative power of will. Without it, no life can exist, and eventually the whole world decays to dust. As such, the world feeds upon and is watched over by a figure called the Seneschal, who receives their position because their will is powerful enough to sustain life and the universe. However, all Seneschals eventually grow tired of their role, whether because the world literally saps their will away, or because their position is inherently unfitting for someone of ambition and strong will, simply because the ultimate power of the Seneschal removes any element of striving from one's life. Should the will of the Seneschal falter in this way, they can send a dragon into the world to seek a replacement. The dragon does this by wreaking havoc upon the world and waiting for someone to show courage and strength of will by defying it against all odds. Once someone distinguishes themselves in this way, the dragon steals that person's heart, turning them into the Arisen, immortal and unaging forevermore until the dragon dies. Their heart being stolen and the world in peril, the Arisen is therefore pushed to set out into the world to hone their skills and will further so that they can eventually defeat the dragon and reclaim their heart. Arisens that fail to do this either remain a perpetual Arisen, or if they die, are transformed into one of the lesser dragonkin. As one final push to make the Arisen face the dragon and prove their will, the dragon steals the person the Arisen loves most, and then offers to leave the land in peace in exchange for the life of that beloved person. Once the dragon is defeated, however, the Everfall opens up in the earth, an endless hole to mimic the endless cycle of Arisen, dragon and Seneschal, wherein the Arisen can create a portal to the domain of the Seneschal. There, the Seneschal explains their role and offers it to the Arisen, should the Arisen succeed in defeating the Seneschal. If the Arisen falls, then they become a new dragon to seek out a new Arisen. If the Arisen wins, they are given a Godsbane blade created from the heart of the Seneschal, with which they kill that Seneschal and take their place. I love this mythos so much because it's all bound together by the theme of stoking the will of the Arisen to maintain the universe as Seneschal. Every element of the mythos revolves around this idea and makes sense in light of it. Now, let's look at the mythos of Dragon's Dogma 2. The cycle of Dragon's Dogma 1 has apparently been overturned. An Arisen named Rothace became Seneschal, but like all Seneschals, became displeased with his role. As such, he refused to perform it, forcing himself out of the Seneschal's realm and back down to Earth, where he founded the Kingdom of Vermund to rule as an immortal sovereign. This event exposes the fact that the Seneschal is not actually the highest being in the universe. There is a greater one, called the Great Will, who decreed the cycle of Arisen, Dragon and Seneschal. In response to this, the Great Will alters the cycle. First, it somehow removes Rothace from his throne. Then it sets things up so that there can only ever be one Arisen, although that Arisen is chosen the same way and is similarly fated to defeat the dragon. However, now, the will of the Arisen serves no purpose whatsoever. Instead of having to prove their will to become Seneschal and maintain the world, the Arisen's fate is simply to become sovereign and slay the dragon, then reign until the next Arisen is chosen. The talk about will remains, but it has no actual purpose. If the Arisen fails in their quest, or in their battle with the dragon, then they likely become a lesser dragonkin again, and a new Arisen is chosen. If the Arisen gives up, then they eventually simply revert to being a normal person, and get their heart back without doing anything, and then a new Arisen is again chosen. We know former Arisens revert back to normal because of the fact that there are several former Arisens in the game, like Luz, combined with our knowledge that there can only be one Arisen at a time. If the Arisen wins, well, then they simply become the Sovereign and that's it. The purpose of this cycle is simply to keep going. None of the previously mentioned outcomes actually make any difference to the world other than to preserve it. It exists because, for some reason, the Great Will decided that so long as the cycle continues, the world will not be destroyed. The only way things go differently is through the events in the true ending of Dragon's Dogma 2. This happens when, instead of fighting the dragon, the Arisen spontaneously decides to climb onto the chest of the dragon and stab themselves with the Godsbane blade, which kills the dragon instead of the Arisen. No explanation is given in-game as to why the Arisen would ever think or choose to do this, or why this is the outcome of such an action. After doing so, the dragon falls into the brine, where we find out that the brine essentially is the Great Will, or serves the Great Will as the Pathfinder, who definitely does seem to be the same entity as the brine. The Pathfinder then gives one last offer to the Arisen to return and be the Sovereign. The Arisen refuses this, and so the brine Pathfinder sends the Arisen back and deliberately ascends to the skies, taking the ocean with them, becoming instead a red cloud above that rains down storms and horrible monsters designed to destroy everything. Despite the Pathfinder's statements that the Great Will set up the cycle to prevent the otherwise inevitable destruction or decay of the world, the Pathfinder as the brine is very clearly going out of their way to destroy things. After the Arisen destroys the monsters sent by the Pathfinder brine, he turns into another dragon, apparently to finish the destruction of the world once and for all. Following this, for no apparent reason other than, again, the deliberate intervention of the Great Will or Pathfinder, the Arisen's pawn is overwhelmed by Dragon's Plague and turns into a dark, oily dragon bent on killing. However, in the true ending, that pawn has acquired some of the will of their Arisen, and so instead of killing their Arisen, carries them up to the new dragon to destroy it. The two work together and kill the dragon. Then, again despite all the talk of inevitable destruction, the new dragon, Pathfinder and brine are now completely gone, and otherwise the world returns entirely to normal. One can only surmise at this point that the Great Will has been defeated somehow, and is leaving this world alone? What do I even say about this? It's just nonsense. The cycle seems utterly pointless to me. Its purpose remains unclear. Supposedly, it was to keep the world alive somehow, but when it's permanently broken, nothing happens, and all the destruction was a result of the active intervention of the Great Will's servants, the Pathfinder or brine. The Arisen's will is completely irrelevant. In fact, if anything, it's an active hindrance to the Great Will, enforcing certain outcomes. Yet that will is insisted upon regardless as a key trait of the Arisen. Unlike the first game, and perhaps because of how the purpose of things is presented so incoherently, or not at all these elements just feel like a senseless jumble, and aren't all directed toward pretty much anything. I felt the same way about several other aspects of the mythos as well. The minor things, like the fact that the Arisen has their heart taken by the dragon, or the presence of the dragon forged. It seems they're just kind of there to make it Dragon's Dogma, and not based on anything. The beautiful Nietzschean themes underpinning the first game are completely gone. Beyond the superficial remnants and mentions of will, it's just stupid. It's stupid and senseless and incoherent. Stuff just happens for no reason, or even in contradiction with the reasons presented. And finally, while I know my analysis of the original story involved a lot of conjecture, I just see nothing of the sort in this sequel story. Sometimes when a story doesn't make sense in itself, its symbolism does make sense. But there is no apparent symbolism here. It's just rubbish, and that's it. So, after all that ranting, here's my conclusion on Dragon's Dogma 2. It's very clear to me that this game had a much larger budget than the first one. That much is obvious to anyone. However, it's also clear to me that that budget went almost solely on the graphics, animations and character creator. The rest of the game feels rushed out, be it the quests, world, and certainly, of course, the story. Namely, the stuff that actually matters received no attention. Only the appearance was actually improved. It disheartens me. 12 years waiting for an utter disappointment. And the damage is not entirely contained to Dragon's Dogma 2 for me either. The sheer stupidity of the story makes me think that the original's depth might have just been an accident. After all, if it were deliberate, and Itsuno was really such a genius, how did he end up producing something so utterly stupid on the second go? My final thought is this. I can say one thing about this game that is very much the same as what we all said about the original. The potential of Dragon's Dogma as a concept, a franchise, whatever you want to call it, is still absolutely immense. And so, despite this humongous rant I've now been on for who knows how long, I'm willing to give Dragon's Dogma one more chance. I'll be watching for Dragon's Dogma 3. I can only hope that finally the potential is fulfilled, rather than held back by budgeting issues or squandered on an idiotic, nonsensical story. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the like button to help me in the algorithm.